Namaste, good evening, and thank you all for joining us. As India celebrates its 75th Independence Day as Azadi ka Amrit Mahotsav today on the 15th of August, we welcome you to our very special show. Welcome to Swatantra Gatha, a saga of Indian freedom struggle brought to you by the Consul General of India, Durban.
There's two of us today. I'm Rachna and she's Saili. And we're here today to talk to you through India's independence and the monumental behind-the-scenes struggle that set it up for success. Handing it over to you, Saili.
Thanks, Rach. India's freedom struggle is not the success story of one man or one movement. It is the most galvanized mass movement that took place across the length and breadth of the country, spanning over a century to finally cement the deed of British withdrawal from our land. History tells us stories about salt satyagrahas and civil disobedience movements, but very little is said about smaller, unorganized resistances from kings to common men. So while we know of Gandhi, Nehru, and Bhagat Singh, the world as it is today knows far too little about Sardar Patel, Subhash Chandra Bose, and Veer Savarkar.
We are here to shed some long overdue spotlight on the mighty but lesser known freedom fighters of those times, those that were shortchanged off of the glory they deserved in our history books. Since the list of these freedom fighters would be nothing short of endless if we go year by year and region by region, we've compiled a shorter list that's inclusive of both genders and highlights the struggles of Indians from north to south and from east to west. Lots of people remember that India's freedom struggle started way back in 1857, but not many remember the key players of those times. There were lots of brave fighters who sacrificed their lives for the dream of free nation even then. And though their attempts were unsuccessful, it is those attempts that ignited the spark of freedom that soon turned into all-consuming fire that transcended generations, regions, and ideologies.
Even before 1857, unorganized but equally strong resistances had started against the British. A few examples being the resistances put up by Rani Valunatiyar, Rani Chennamma, and her army chief Sangolle Rayana, and others. Rani Valunatiyar was the queen of Sivaganga from 1760 to 1790. Rani Nachiyar was trained in war weapons, martial arts like Vallari and Silambam, horse riding, and archery. She was a scholar in many languages, with particular proficiency in French, English, and Urdu. When her husband, Muthuvadu Ganathapariya, was killed by the British soldiers in collusion with the son of the Nawab of Arcot, she formed an army and sought an alliance with Gopal Nayakar and Hyder Ali, with the aim of attacking the British. What's more was she was successful and she challenged them in 1780. When they discovered British arm inventories, she is said to have arranged a suicide attack by her faithful follower, Kuyili. Kuyili, India's first suicide attack martyr, was the then army commander, and she is said to have doused herself in ghee and to have set herself on fire before walking right into the said storehouse. Rani Nachiyar formed a women's army named Udayal in honor of her adopted daughter, who died while blowing up British arsenal. Rani Nachiyar was one of the very few rulers who regained her once lost kingdom right from the British, and then went on to rule it for one more decade.
While Rani Velu Nachiyar was the pride of Tamil Nadu, we had Rani Chennamma in Karnataka a few decades later. Chennamma's husband died in 1824, leaving her with a son and the queendom of the volatile state of Kittur. After her son's death in the same year, Rani Chennamma was left with an uphill task of saving Kittur from the British. One of her first strategies to do so was the adoption of Shivalingappa in 1824 and then his subsequent naming as the heir to her throne. This irked the East India Company, who ordered Shivalingappa's expulsion on the pretext of the doctrine of lapse introduced by Lord Dalhousie, the Governor-General of the time, a tool used by the British to annex several independent Indian states in 1848. This doctrine was based on the idea that in case a ruler of an independent state died childless, the right of ruling the state reverted or lapsed to the sovereign. The state of Kittur came under the administration of the Dharwad Collectorate in charge of St. John Thackeray, of which Mr. Chaplin was the commissioner. Both did not recognize the new ruler and regents and notified Kittur to accept the British regime.
Rani Chennamma sent a letter to Mount Stuart Elphinstone, Lieutenant Governor of the Bombay Presidency, pleading her cause, but the request was turned down and war broke out. The British tried to confiscate the treasure and jewels of Kittur, valued at around 1.5 million rupees. They attacked with a force of 20,797 men and 437 guns, mainly from the 3rd Troop of Madras Native Horse Artillery. In the first round of the war, during October 1824, British forces lost heavily, and St. John Thackeray, collector and political agent, was killed in this war. Amatur Ballappa, a lieutenant of Rani Chennamma, was mainly responsible for his killing and for the other losses taken by the British forces. 2 British officers, Sir Walter Elliot and Mr. Stevenson, were also taken as hostages. Rani Chennamma released them after reaching an understanding with Mr. Chaplin that the war would be terminated, but Chaplin continued the war and with even more forces. During the second assault, the sub-collector of Solapur and nephew of Thomas Munro was killed. Rani Chennamma fought fiercely with the aid of her deputy Sangolli Rayanna and her henchman Guru Sidappa, but was ultimately captured and imprisoned at Ballyhongal Fort, where she died on the 2nd February 1829. Sangolli Rayanna participated in the 1824 rebellion and was arrested by the British, but they later released him. Despite that, he continued to fight the British and wanted to install the adopted son of King Mallasarja and Rani Chennamma as the ruler of Kittur. He mobilized local people and started a guerrilla-type war against the British.
Then came the 1857 Saboy Mutiny. The Indian Rebellion of 1857 was a major one, but it was ultimately an unsuccessful uprising against the rule of the British East India Company, which functioned as a sovereign power on behalf of the British Crown. The rebellion began on 10th May 1857 in the form of a mutiny of sepoys of the company's army in the garrison town of Meerut, some 40 miles northeast of Delhi. It then erupted into other mutinies and civilian rebellions, chiefly in the upper Gangetic Plain and central India, though incidents of revolt also occurred further north and east. The rebellion posed a considerable threat to British power in that region and was contained only with the rebels' defeat in Gwalior on 20th June 1858. On 1st November 1858, the British granted amnesty to all rebels not involved in murder, though they did not declare the hostilities to have formally ended until 8 July 1859.
A major cause of resentment that arose 10 months prior to the rebellion was the General Service Enlistment Act of 25th July 1856. Earlier, men of the Bengal Army had been exempted from overseas service. Specifically, they were enlisted only for service in territories to which they could march. Governor General Lord Dalhousie saw this as an anomaly, since all sepoys of the Madras and Bombay armies and the 6 General Service battalions of the Bengal Army had accepted an obligation to serve overseas if required. As a result, the burden of providing contingents for active service in Burma, readily accessible only by sea, and China had fallen disproportionately onto the 2 smaller presidency armies. As signed into effect by Lord Canning, Dalhousie's successor as Governor General, the Act required only new recruits to the Bengal Army to accept a commitment for general service. However, serving high caste sepoys were fearful that it would eventually be extended to them as well, and that it would prevent sons from following their fathers into an army especially in families with a strong tradition for family service. The final spark was provided by the ammunition used, and to be more specific, the new Enfield pattern 1853 rifled musket. These rifles, which fired minié balls, had a tighter fit than the earlier muskets and used paper cartridges that came pre-greased. To load the rifle, sepoys had to bite the cartridge open to release the gunpowder. The grease used on these cartridges was rumored to include tallow derived from beef, unpalatable to Hindus, and lard derived from pork, offensive to Muslims. Several months of increased tensions, coupled with various incidents, preceded the actual rebellion. And today, we actually know exactly where the phrase refusing to bite the bullet originally came from.
So, who were the heroes of the 1857 revolt? Rani Lakshmibai, for one. Rani Lakshmibai has inspired many books and movies. And why not? Her story is one of grit, glory, and brave rebellion. Lakshmibai, the Rani of Jhansi, a Maratha bastion, was the wife of the Maharaja Gangadhar Rao. She was one of the leading figures of the Indian Rebellion of 1857. When states after states were no longer able to hold their own against the British, here was another fearless queen who refused to buckle. During the Indian Mutiny of 1857-58, despite her fort being under siege, this brave queen of Jhansi is remembered for her stiff rebellion and refusal to surrender till death. She died at just 29 years of age, killed in combat after having successfully led an assault on Gwalior. She is most ritualistically remembered as the queen who led armies to battle with a young son tied behind her back. During her last fight, she was betrayed by one of her own, Jayajirao Scindia, but not for one moment did this stubborn rebel bow down to the British, and not for one moment did she agree to the policies or taxes.
Then there's Mangal Pandey. We talk of leaders and of people who have led, but here's one name that forces us to recognize it despite it being one of a soldier and not a prominent top leader. And that name is Mangal Pandey. Mangal Pandey was an Indian soldier who played the most key part in the outbreak rebellion of 1857. He was a sepoy from the 34th Bengal Native Infantry. On 29th March 1857 at the Barakpur Parade Ground near Calcutta, 29-year-old Mangal Pandey declared that he would rebel against his commanders as he was angered by the recent actions of the East India Company. Informed about Pandey's behavior, Sergeant Major James Hewson went out to investigate, only to have Pandey shoot at him. Hewson raised an alarm, and his adjutant, Lieutenant Henry Baugh, came out to investigate the unrest then. Pandey opened fire once again but hit Baugh's horse instead. General John Hearsay was next to come out to the parade ground to investigate, and he was the one who later claimed that Mangal Pandey was in some kind of religious frenzy. He ordered the Indian commander of the quartered guard, Jamadar Ishwari Prasad, to arrest Mangal Pandey, but Jamadar refused. Others, such as the quartered guard and other sepoys present, also drew back from restraining or arresting Mangal Pandey, with the single exception of a soldier named Sheikh Paltu. Sheikh Paltu restrained Pandey from continuing his attack, and for having pioneered the sepoy mutiny where he killed 2 British soldiers, Mangal Pandey was later hanged to death.
Moving on to India's organized freedom movements. The decades following the rebellion were a period of growing political awareness, the manifestation of Indian public opinion, and the emergence of Indian leadership at both national and provincial levels. Dadabhai Nauroji formed the East India Association in 1867, and Surendranath Banerjee founded the Indian National Association in 1876. Inspired by a suggestion made by A.O. Hume, a retired Scottish civil servant, 72 Indian delegates met in Bombay in 1885 and founded the Indian National Congress. They were mostly members of the upwardly mobile and successful Western-educated provincial elites engaged in professions such as law, teaching, and journalism. At its inception, Congress had no well-defined ideology and commanded few of the resources essential to political organization. Instead, it functioned more as a debating society that met annually to express its loyalty to the British Raj and passed numerous resolutions on less controversial issues such as civil rights or opportunities in government, especially in the civil service. These resolutions were submitted to the Viceroy's government and occasionally to the British Parliament, but the Congress's early gain was slight. Despite its claim to represent all India, the Congress voiced the interests of Indian urban elites, and the number of participants from the social and economic backgrounds remained negligible. However, this period of history is still crucial because it represented the first political mobilization of Indians coming from all parts of the subcontinent and the first articulation of the idea of India as one nation rather than a collection of independent princely states. This was also the period when the influence of socio-religious groups such as Arya Samaj, started by Swami Dayanand Saraswati, and Brahmo Samaj, founded by Raja Ram Mohan Roy and others, became evident in pioneering reforms of Indian society. The work of men like Swami Vivekananda, Ramakrishna, Sri Aurobindo, V.O. Chidambaram Pillai, Subramanya Bharati, Bankim Chandra Chatterjee, Rabindranath Tagore, and Dadabhai Nauroji, as well as women such as the Scot-Irish sister Nivedita, spread the passion for rejuvenation and freedom. The rediscovery of India's indigenous history by several European and Indian scholars also fed into the rise of nationalism among Indians.
So, what led to the rise of nationalism and nationalists? The years after the formation of the INC in 1885, the debating transitioned into more definitive thought. This is when the freedom movement received a greater boost of common ideology, monetary backing, and numbers, at least to a greater extent than what the local small-scale movements were receiving. The Indian National Congress and its leaders, both the moderates and the radicals, then took the struggle into the next 2 decades with greater intensity and harder stances against the British. So, in a way, the formation of the INC was indeed a good thing for the Indian freedom movement. But as many freedom fighters united, different ideologies could no longer breathe under this shared dream future. There were those in the Congress that believed in pressure tactics through non-violent protests. And then there were those who believed in doing whatever was necessary to break the backbone of the British Raj, even if it meant choking their supply chains through tactical use of arms and even loss of life.
Though Gandhiji made non-violent protests and hunger strikes famous around the globe, he was not in the picture just yet, as he only returned from South Africa in 1915. It is because history has been so critically skewed that many no longer know of the original moderates of the Indian National Congress, namely Dadabhai Nauroji and Gopal Krishna Gokhale. It is only if you take the effort to consciously peek through the veil of obscurity shrouding so many others that you know things like Gopal Krishna Gokhale being the political guru of Gandhi, and of him having guided the Mahatma to travel around India and take up the earnest fight against the British. And it was Dadabhai Nauroji who prophesied loudly to the British Parliament that by constantly undermining Indian interests, they were inviting a rebellion unlike anything they had ever seen before.
On the other side of the split were the aggressive radicals, the ones who did not shy away from violence where necessary, since they believed that it would give faster results as it hurt the British more. The radicals were led by the fiery Bal Gangadhar Tilak, popularly known as Lokmanya Tilak, who coined the slogan Swarajya ha माझा जन्मसिद्ध हक्क आहे आणि तो मी मिळवणारच. Swaraj is my birthright and I shall have it. What Gandhi did in his own non-violent, peaceful way was a long-drawn strategy that slowly and steadily made its inroads into the British Empire's policies, decimating them through the power of the collective. Lokmanya Tilak did exactly that in a faster, more aggressive, and strategic way by using a select few people to attack the British at the places and in the manner that hurt them hard. His radical camp also consisted of Lala Lajpat Rai and Bipin Chandra Pal, and the trio of Lal, Bal, Pal made life in India for the Britishers extremely uncomfortable. Though the Swadeshi movement, the movement of boycotting Indian goods and being self reliant to hit British coffers, is better associated with the name of Mahatma Gandhi and his khadi textiles, it is actually the brainchild of this think tank. They choked the logistic points of British and attacked their stocks. They planned secret attacks that targeted armories so they could steal British arms and use them to fight the British themselves. So big was the threat of these three well educated, learned men who wrote editorials in newspapers on the one hand and then hit British facilities with arms on the other, that Britishers identified them as extremists, or as modern day lingo goes, terrorists.
His hits on the British accumulated big costs, making staying in India costlier for the British day by day. He is fondly remembered by many as the first leader of the Indian independence movement, the maker of modern India, and the father of the Indian unrest. It was during this period that India saw the partition of Bengal, another atrocity inflicted on us by Lord Curzon to ensure his grip on the region. It also saw the formation of India's Muslim League, and it saw several conspiracies and assassinations, including the assassination of Lord Hardinge, the Viceroy of India. This was also the period when a peasant movement led by Muhammad Ali Jinnah in Gujarat.
So, what happened during the Bengal partition? In July 1905, Lord Curzon, the Viceroy and Governor General, ordered the partition of the province of Bengal, supposedly for improvements in administrative efficiency in the huge and populous region. However, Indian leaders and the people of India felt that it was an attempt of the British government to weaken the idea of nationalism and break the unity between Hindus and Muslims. The partition also precipitated increased activity from the then still nascent militant nationalist revolutionary movement, which was particularly gaining strength in Bengal and Maharashtra from the last decade of the 1800s. In Bengal, Anushilan Samiti, led by brothers Aurobindo and Barin Ghosh, organized a number of attacks on figureheads of the Raj, culminating in an attempt on the life of a British judge in Muzaffarpur. Jugantar or Yugantar was the other of the two main secret revolutionary societies operating in Bengal for the Indian independence. This association, just like Anushilan Samiti, started in the guise of suburban fitness club. Several Jugantar members were later arrested, hanged, or deported for life to the cellular jail in Andaman, and many of them joined the communist consolidation in the cellular jail there. The activities in tandem, including the killing of the British judge in Muzaffarpur, precipitated the Alipur bombing case, and a number of revolutionaries were killed or captured and put on trial. Revolutionaries like Khudiram Bose, Prafulla Chaki, Kanai Lal Dutt, etc., who were either killed or hanged, then became household names.
It was around this time that Gandhi returned to India. Mahatma Gandhi is indeed one of the most prolific Indian freedom fighters, well known across the world. Though he made non-violent protests and hunger strikes famous around the globe, he was not the originator of this thought. This idea had been used by many moderates inside the Indian National Congress after its formation in 1885, and he got past the baton when he returned from South Africa in 1915. But Gandhiji perfected the idea of crushing an enemy without using violence or shedding a drop of blood into an art form for the world to see. After the death of Lokmanya Tilak, the leader of the radicals faction of the INC, Mahatma Gandhi rose to prominence inside the INC and led several big movements against the British, such as the Satyagraha against the Roulette Act, the mass boycott non-cooperation movement, with others like Subhash Chandra Bose, Chittaranjan Das, and Gulzari Lal, the Salt March or the Dandi March against salt taxes, protests against the British segregation of India's untouchables, and the civil disobedience movement.
To say that he was the most prominent player in India's freedom movement would not be an understatement. His brand of passive-aggressive fire consolidated India's freedom struggle on the grassroots level and gave the Britishers blow after blow of frustrations that they could never really recover from. After Bal Gangadhar Tilak passed away in 1920, the balance of power between the moderates and radicals firmly shifted to the moderates inside the INC. This caused the rise of Mahatma Gandhi and his brand of passive aggression. As small-scale revolts rocked the British Raj across the country, the Roulette Act was brought down to curb them. This act gave the Britishers the power to arrest without trial anyone engaging in revolts, and this sparked massive outrage in the nation.
To protest the Roulette Act, Mahatma Gandhi gave the call for a non-violent Roulette Satyagraha. This was the very first pan-India movement, and in essence, the act consolidated regional revolts into a national effort. The act led to the arrest of many Indian leaders, including Dr. Saifuddin Kichlu and Dr. Satyapal, and of course, both the anger and the agitation grew. On April 1919, a huge peaceful crowd had gathered in protest of the arrests in Amritsar. General Dyer opened fire at the congregation, killing thousands in what is known today as the Jallianwala Bagh massacre. This horrific and inhumane crime was later avenged when General Dyer was assassinated by Indian revolutionary Udham Singh, who belonged to the Ghadar party. This and several other incidents showed how little the British cared about the people. It cemented the nationwide agitation and ignited the fire that Indians would now take it to the very end, no matter the cost. Revolts started happening in every nook and cranny.
From 1919 to 1924, Indian Muslims started the Khilafat movement under the leadership of Shaukat Ali and Muhammad Ali. From 1920 to 1922, Gandhiji ran the non-cooperation movement against the British, an unsuccessful attempt at passively forcing the Britishers to grant India self-governance rights. Freedom fighters like Subhash Chandra Bose, Chittaranjan Das, and Gulzari Lal were also involved in this movement. The movement involved all Indians working in the local bodies run by British to relinquish their titles in protest. While Gandhiji was organizing his peaceful protests, others were busy harming the British in other ways. The revolutionary movement for Indian independence, for example, comprised of actions of violent underground revolutionary factions. Rash Bihari Bose was called the father of these Indian revolutionary movements. Groups believing in armed revolution against the British fell into this category, and they opposed generally peaceful civil disobedience movement ideology spearheaded by Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi. These revolutionary groups were mainly concentrated in Bengal, Maharashtra, Bihar, and the United Provinces of Punjab, while more groups were scattered across India. It was these violent underground revolutionary factions that let loose all hellfire on the British during this time. The likes of Bhagat Singh, Rajguru, Sukhdev, Batukeshwar Dutt, and others even planned and executed 2 bombings on the Central Legislative Assembly in New Delhi. They were later caught and hanged for the same, executed with the intent of setting an example.
In 1925, Dr. K.B. Hedgewar, a political disciple of B.S. Munje, formed a socio-cultural organization with the name RSS, Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh. After reading V.D. Savarkar's works and meeting Savarkar in the Ratnagiri prison in 1925, Dr. Hedgewar was influenced by him and founded the RSS with the objective of strengthening the spirit of nationalism. In 1942, Rash Behari Bose helped form the Indian National Army by bringing together Indian prisoners of war captured by Japan in the Malaysian campaign. Later, Rash Behari Bose handed over INA to Subhash Chandra Bose. It was revived under the leadership of Subhash Chandra Bose after his arrival in Southeast Asia in 1943.
Subhash Chandra Bose, fondly remembered as Netaji Subhash Chandra Bose, was a defiant nationalist who wanted to leverage the World War II for gaining India's independence. He was part of a more militant wing, but this brave freedom fighter also participated in prominent national movements like non-cooperation movement. Though Tilak fanned the flames of the Indian freedom movement till the 1920s, and the Mahatma kept them going through the 1930s and the 1940s, it is Netaji Bose, with his army and his sailors, that kept the punches flowing right through to the last knockout. Sadly, he died in 1945 and did not live to see the fruits of his labor getting the success that they deserved. Netaji Bose has given India plenty of notable quotes thanks to his fiery oration. Two that are most remembered today are "Tum mujhe khoon do, main tumhe azadi dunga." You give me blood, I'll give you your freedom. And "Azadi di nahi jati, li jati hai." Freedom is not given, it is taken.
What was the Royal Navy Revolt? After the Second World War, the Royal Navy Revolt was the final nail to the coffin for the British Raj in India. The Royal Indian Navy Mutiny involved a total strike and subsequent mutiny by Indian sailors of the Royal Indian Navy. It took place on board ships and show establishments at Bombay Harbour on 18 February 1946. From the initial flashpoints in Bombay, the mutiny spread and found support throughout British India, from Karachi to Calcutta, and ultimately came to involve 78 ships, 20 show establishments, and 20,000 sailors. The agitations, mass strikes, demonstrations, and consequently support for the mutineers therefore continued several days even after the mutiny had been called off. Along with this, the assessment may be made that it described in crystal clear terms to the government that the British Indian Armed Forces could no longer be universally relied upon for support in crisis, and even more, it was more likely itself to be the source of the sparks that would ignite trouble in a country fast slipping out of the scenario of political settlement.
And finally, India's bloody freedom and a partition. By the late 1930s and early 1940s, the British could visibly see that they were nearing the end of their time in India, as Mahatma Gandhi launched his third successful movement, the Quit India movement. Yes, these big movements were a pain to deal with, but the smaller ones were absolute killers. Like the Patri Sarkar of Satara, for example. From August 1943 to May 1946, freedom fighter Nana Patel consolidated some 150 odd villages in Satara, Maharashtra, and declared them to be independent of British rule. Their stronghold was so faultless that despite several attempts to get this region back under British control, the British could do little else but watch. Knowing they were losing their grip on things here, the British made one last-ditch attempt to salvage things in 1942 by trying a truce-like situation known as the Crips Mission. The Indians, now smelling blood, wanted to go for nothing else than a full and complete independence and did not agree to the terms laid out by the British, who at one point even agreed to release their hold and leave the country, but leave their army behind. Imagine that.
Still, despite acknowledging their fading glory, the British still managed a few more heinous crimes before they finally left. One was, of course, the manufactured famine in Bengal. Winston Churchill killed millions of starvation and malnutrition in India by diverting all rice to England, a crime just as heinous as the Holocaust, but somehow lost in history due to the power of the perpetrators in controlling history and the short memories of brown victims. And lastly, the partition. The British left India not just several $billions poorer as they stole, but also several thousand kilometers smaller than they had found it. Despite several factions rejecting the idea of a partition, the British, along with a handful of powerful Indian leaders, agreed to dividing the nation on religious lines, with the Muslim nation being Pakistan and the Hindu nation behind India. This parting gift by the British left millions of Indians dead or displaced in the ensuing riots. This parting gift also left us with the lifelong problem now known as Pakistan. But at last, India achieved its independence at the stroke of midnight on 15th August 1947. The Indian national flag was finally hoisted by India's first Prime Minister, Jawaharlal Nehru.
The House will rise in order to take the pledge. Here go the chimes.
Countless freedom fighters gave their lives to the nation, and millions of faceless, nameless, now lost forever in history, ordinary Indians fought for it, with every little power that they had. The nation did not receive independence because of a Tilak, a Nehru, or a Gandhi. She achieved independence because she bled from millions of bodies in the countless revolutions that spanned a century, if not more, with rebellions from Indian kings and rebellions from the people, like the Malabar resistance way back in 1790s. The Indian independence struggle is truly the story of water drops chipping away at hard rock, slowly, steadily, and persistently, till the British had no other choice left but to cut their losses. And still, there are thousands of unsung heroes that contributed to this struggle, and before we end, we must name at least a few of them, the ones with the most noteworthy contributions.
Vinayak Damodar Savarkar. Vinayak Damodar Savarkar, or Veer Savarkar, was another prominent freedom fighter, activist, and writer involved in India's long freedom struggle. He is best known for trying to unite the nation against the British by making them identify with Hindutva or Hinduness. Though the term has been gravely maligned in modern context today, Savarkar himself defined the terms to include everyone who considered India to be the land of their ancestors, since it was the land where the Hindu religion originated. Veer Savarkar took the Indian struggle to the UK too, where he founded societies such as Free India Society and freely and bravely wrote against the British and their policies in India. His words were so virulent, and he invoked a great many countrymen to break the shackles and take up arms against the British. He also worked tirelessly to eradicate the malaise of untouchability that was prevalent in India then, so much so that even B.R. Ambedkar was inspired by his efforts. Veer Savarkar was sentenced to life twice, a whopping 5 years at India's notorious jail, Kala Pani.
Bhimrao Ambedkar. Bhimrao Ambedkar, or Baba Saheb Ambedkar, was the Indian economist, jurist, and social reformer. He is best known for his Dalit Buddhist movement and for his campaigns against the social discrimination of India's untouchables. But his achievements during and post India's independence struggle go much further than that. B.R. Ambedkar was the architect of the Constitution of India and the first Union Law and Justice Minister in the very first Indian cabinet under PM Jawaharlal Nehru. He actively worked towards Indian independence, and his father too served in the Indian Army. Dr. B.R. Ambedkar is credited for setting up India's first finance commission, and his ideas were instrumental in setting up Reserve Bank of India. He was also vocally against Article 370 that gave Jammu and Kashmir a special status, and thankfully it has finally been scrapped now.
Sardar Vallabhbhai Patel. Sardar Vallabhbhai Patel, or just Sardar Patel, served as the first Deputy Prime Minister under Jawaharlal Nehru. He is known as the Iron Man of India, and he is the sole uniting force behind India's princely states acceding to the Republic of India. Post-independence, India was still fragmented into several princely states that were ruled by local monarchies. His commitment to national identity and the idea of India as a country ensured that he completed the mammoth task of integrating 562 princely states into one political integration. All this was post-independence. His achievements pre-independence have been no less. For example, in 1928, Sardar Patel successfully led Bardoli landowners in their resistance against increase in taxes. He was posthumously awarded the Bharat Ratna, and today he stands tall as a statue of unity in Gujarat, the biggest statue in the whole world.
Sarojini Naidu. Sarojini Naidu, an Indian political activist and poet, was a prominent figure in India's independence struggle. In her writings, she was a staunch proponent of women's emancipation and civil rights, and because of her contribution to poetry, she is also known as the Nightingale of India. She was the first woman president of the Indian National Congress and also the first female governor of the Indian state now known as Uttar Pradesh. Sarojini Naidu was a firm believer of Satyagraha and was an ardent follower of Mahatma Gandhi. She joined the Indian independence movement in the wake of Bengal's partition by the British, and she was imprisoned several times for her activities, including her participation in the Quit India movement.
Kalam Azad. Abul Kalam Azad, India's first Minister of Education in the Jawaharlal Nehru cabinet, was an Indian independence activist, Islamic theologian, and writer. Originally from Mecca, Abul Kalam Azad supported Gandhiji's non-cooperation movement in India and also joined the INC in 1920. He was a big proponent of Hindu-Muslim unity. He has a famous quote proclaiming that if an angel were to offer Swaraj within 24 hours, if the INC were to abandon its Hindu-Muslim unity policy, he would turn his back on Swaraj. He would rather delay Swaraj than harm India.
Bengali Venkaiah. Bengali Venkaiah is a name only a few know of, but he was the designer of the draft Indian national flag design on which the current Indian flag is based. Bengali was a freedom fighter that greatly revered Mahatma Gandhi. He was a linguist, a geologist, and a writer too. Bengali Venkaiah met Mahatma Gandhi in South Africa, where he had been sent by the British Army to fight the Anglo-Boer War. Mahatma Gandhi shaped his aspirations for a free India thereafter.
Birsa Munda. Birsa Munda was a tribal Indian freedom fighter and religious leader from the Munda tribe. Birsa Munda is credited with starting a tribal religious millenarium movement in the Bengal Presidency, which is present-day Jharkhand. The main reason for the Munda rebellion was to restore the customary land rights of the local tribes that were being forcibly deprived due to British colonial policies. He fought against grave injustices like movement restrictions on the tribals, gazing taxes, and agriculture shifting bans. This Birsa movement forced the British to introduce laws that protected the rights of these tribals.
Rani Valunatiyar was a Naga political and spiritual leader who led a revolt against the British from the Naga lands in the northeast. She was just 13 when she joined the Horaka religious movement, which later became a political movement to drive out the British from Manipur and surrounding Naga areas. She is well known for her armed resistances, and she was imprisoned at Shillong jail for them. This daughter of the hills spent 14 years in jail for having picked up the cause for Indian independence. She is also known to have started her own version of the non-cooperation movement among the Naga tribes in the 1930s.
Chinnaswamy Subramanya Bharati. Subramanya Bharati was a Tamil journalist, social reformer, and independence activist. Popularly known as Mahakavi Bharati, was an influential figure, and his poetry helped rally the masses in Tamil Nadu and rise in support of Indian independence. His poetry not just showed his pride in his India, but it also carried the vision of what a free India would mean. As a journalist and sub-editor, Bharati would often publish political cartoons and even had a weekly paper printed in red to symbolize revolution. His brave and provocative articles did not go unnoticed by British imperialists, and to avoid being arrested on warrant, he spent significant time in exile. During his exile, he came into contact with the military wing of the independence movement, and people like Aurobindo, Lajpat Rai, and VVS Iyer further shaped his aspirations for India. He was promptly arrested and imprisoned when he tried to go mainstream again.
These are just a handful of names in a history that is dotted with thousands of stars, thousands of events too, because India's freedom struggle wasn't short, nor was it easy. They say those who forget history live to see it repeating itself. Hence, on every 15th August, we strive to remember. Before we end, let's end it on a note of truth. The British did not grant us our independence. We Indians earned it with blood and with sweat. The British did not leave India. They were rightly kicked out after a long, hard struggle. The British partitioned our nation, but they left because they could never break our spirit, for we would never have stopped fighting. Thank you for watching. Jai Hind.